New Hampshire, February 9th. A car is found crashed into a snowbank. The air is freezing. The ground is covered in a fresh white blanket of snow. But here's the paradox. There are no footprints leading away from the car. None. It's as if Maura Murray stepped out of her vehicle and simply evaporated. For years, the snow paradox has haunted this case.
I've spent a lot of time looking at this case, and one thing kept bothering me. We've spent decades looking at the ground for answers, but maybe we've been looking in the wrong place. Because while the snow suggests she didn't walk away, the clock suggests she didn't have time to leave at all.
This is the 7-minute window, the gap between the last witness seeing movement at the Saturn and the first police officer arriving on scene. Today, we're going to examine why those 7 minutes may be the most important clue in this entire investigation. Because if the snow doesn't explain where Maura Murray went, and the timeline doesn't explain how she disappeared, then the mystery we've been chasing for more than 20 years may be the wrong mystery entirely.
To understand what happened to Maura Murray, we have to start with the few things we can actually prove. Not theories, not rumors, not 20 years of speculation. Just facts. On the evening of February 9th, 2004, Maura Murray's black Saturn lost control on a sharp curve along Route 112 in Haverhill, New Hampshire. The car spun, the airbags deployed, and the vehicle came to rest facing the wrong direction in the road. For a moment, this is just a traffic accident. Nothing more. A young woman, a damaged car, a cold winter night. The condition of the car tells us something important. The airbags had deployed, the windshield was damaged, and later, investigators would find a rag stuffed into the Saturn's tailpipe. At first, that detail doesn't seem important. The kind of thing you might overlook in a larger scene. A small object. A passing observation. Yet before this story is over, we'll come back to it.
Nearby residents Faith and Tim Westman heard the crash from inside their home. When they looked outside, they didn't see a crime scene. They saw a driver moving around the vehicle. Someone who appeared alive, conscious, present. This is one of the last moments in the case that feels solid. A crashed car, a visible driver, multiple witnesses. Nothing mysterious. Nothing impossible.
Minutes after the crash, the silence was broken by the rumble of a school bus. Local driver Butch Atwood had just finished his route when he noticed the Saturn sitting at the side of the road. He stopped to help. This conversation is one of the most important moments in the entire case. Not because of what happened, but because of what happened next. As far as we know, Butch Atwood is the last person to speak with Maura Murray. The last confirmed witness. The final point in the timeline where Maura is unquestionably present. Butch later described her as shaken up, cold, upset, but not seriously injured. When he offered to call for help, she refused. Instead, she told him she had already contacted AAA. There's something about that moment that stands out. She is still there, still speaking, still responding, still part of a normal exchange.
Now, there is a problem with that.
The area had little to no cell service. Whether Maura knew that or not, one thing becomes clear. She did not want help, and she did not want police involvement. Why? Butch eventually decided to call authorities himself. He drove the short distance back to his home and contacted police from his landline. A routine decision, one that should have ended the story. Instead, it became the beginning of the mystery.
This is the moment that keeps pulling me back into the case. Because at this point, Maura isn't missing. She's not a mystery. She's standing beside her car, talking to a witness. Everything still makes sense. Then, something changes. Butch leaves. The call is made. Police are on the way. And somewhere inside the next few minutes, the timeline begins to break. When officers arrive, Maura Murray is gone. No witness sees her leave. No witness sees her get into a vehicle. No witness sees her enter the woods. The last confirmed sighting has ended, and the missing minutes have begun. To understand why this disappearance is so unsettling, you have to understand one thing. Maura Murray was never truly alone. On that cold stretch of Route 112, she wasn't hidden deep in the wilderness. She wasn't on an empty road miles from civilization. She was surrounded by people. People who noticed the crash. People who watched the scene. People who should have seen something.
From their kitchen window, Faith and Tim Westman had a direct view of the Saturn. A short distance away, the Murats could see the roadway from their property. And just 100 yards from the crash site, Butch Atwood had already returned home after speaking with Maura. This is where the accepted story starts to feel uncomfortable. Because most disappearances begin with isolation. A dark road. An empty space. A moment where no one is looking. But that isn't what we have here. We have witnesses. Multiple witnesses. All positioned around the same small section of road.
Faith Westman is on the phone reporting the accident. The Murats are not continuously watching. Butch Atwood is inside making a call. Everyone looks away. Then looks back. And somewhere inside those fragmented moments, something changes. Because when people retell this story, they often imagine Maura running into the darkness, disappearing down the road, vanishing into the woods. But before we decide where she went, there is a more important question. Who actually saw her leave? People go missing every day, but they rarely disappear, while witnesses are still watching. So I went back through the statements, looking for the moment Maura left the scene. The witness who saw her walk away. The neighbor who saw her enter the woods. The driver who watched her head down the road. Do you know how many people reported seeing Maura Murray leave that crash site? Nobody. No witness watched her walk away. No witness followed her movements. No witness could tell investigators which direction she went. The most important transition in the entire case happened without anyone seeing it. We know Maura was there. We know people were nearby. Yet the exact moment she leaves the story is the one moment nobody can account for.
Every mystery develops a default explanation. In the Maura Murray case, that explanation arrived almost immediately. She panicked after the crash. She crossed the snowbank. She entered the woods. And somewhere in the darkness, she disappeared. It sounds reasonable. It sounds logical. Yet the closer you look, the harder it becomes to reconcile with the scene itself. This is the snow paradox. On the night of February 9th, the snow wasn't merely part of the landscape. It was evidence. Fresh snowfall covered the ground. Snowbanks lined the road. The forest beyond the crash site sat behind a white barrier that should have recorded movement. Think about what that means. A person can disappear. A person can get lost. A person can make a bad decision. Yet moving through deep snow leaves traces. Footprints. Broken surfaces. Disturbed snowbanks. A visible path from one place to another. So ask yourself a simple question. If Maura Murray climbed over those snowbanks and entered the woods, what should investigators have found? Not her location, just evidence that she went that way. A direction, a trail, something. When law enforcement arrived, they didn't focus solely on the Saturn. They examined the surrounding area. Flashlights swept across the snowbanks. Attention moved toward the tree line. Investigators searched for the point where a frightened young woman might have entered the forest. Yet the scene created a contradiction. No clearly identified trail leading away from the roadway. No obvious break through the snowbank. No visible path pointing into the woods. This is the detail that kept pulling me back. The timeline already felt tight. The witness gap already felt strange. Now the snow introduces something else entirely. A second contradiction. The most common explanation now requires something difficult to accept. Movement, without a visible record of movement. To accept the woods theory, you have to accept that Maura crossed deep snow and somehow left behind no clear route investigators could follow. Maybe that's possible, but it creates a new problem. And every new problem places more pressure on the accepted timeline. This is the moment the investigation begins to shift. If the woods cannot fully explain the disappearance, then attention returns to the road. The same road lined with witnesses. The same road police arrived on minutes later. The same road where Maura Murray was last seen standing beside her car. The snow doesn't tell us what happened. It tells us something else. The simplest explanation may not be as simple as it first appears. And if the woods aren't the answer, then the final minutes become even harder to explain. Most people see the Maura Murray case as a mystery that has lasted more than 2 decades. Yet the part that matters most doesn't span years. It spans minutes. At first glance, the timeline seems generous. The crash is reported. Witnesses observe the scene. A bus driver stops to help. Police are called. An officer is dispatched. On paper, it feels like enough time for almost anything to happen. The closer we examine those minutes, the smaller they become. Start with the crash itself. Maura isn't immediately alone. Witnesses are already watching. Then Butch Atwood arrives and speaks with her. Several more minutes disappear. Next comes the phone call. Faith Westman is speaking with dispatch, while periodically looking toward the Saturn. The crash site remains the center of attention. People aren't staring continuously. Still, they aren't ignoring it either. This is where the timeline begins to tighten. Every confirmed event consumes time. Every witness interaction removes opportunity. Every known observation reduces empty space in the story. The accepted narrative asks us to believe that Maura left the scene between the last witness observation and the arrival of police. A reasonable idea, until you start measuring it. Once the known events are placed in order, the timeline doesn't feel open anymore. It feels compressed. What originally appears to be a large window starts shrinking into a very narrow gap. A gap measured in only a few minutes.
This was the moment I stopped thinking about theories and started thinking about time. Not where Maura went, not who she met, just time. How much of it was actually available, and what could realistically happen inside it? In those final minutes, Maura would have needed to leave the car, make a decision, move away from the scene, avoid nearby witnesses, and disappear before police arrived. All without creating a clear trail, all without drawing attention, all without leaving behind a single confirmed sighting. The smaller the timeline becomes, the larger the contradiction grows. A voluntary disappearance becomes harder to explain. A chance encounter becomes harder to explain. Even an abduction begins to require precision that feels unlikely for a narrow window of time.
The clock keeps moving. The available time keeps shrinking. And the disappearance starts to feel less like an escape and more like a mathematical problem. The question is no longer, where did Maura Murray go? The question becomes, how did she vanish inside such a narrow window of time? The timeline says she disappeared. The timeline also says she barely had time to do it. And those two facts refuse to sit comfortably together. If the timeline only gives Maura Murray 7 minutes to disappear, then the next step is simple. Translate time into space. What can a human actually do inside 420 seconds? On this road, in these conditions? On a map, Route 112 looks like an open path, a line through New Hampshire, a way out. On the ground that night, it was something else entirely. Narrow, frozen, surrounded by forest on both sides. A corridor with very few options, and even fewer places to hide. Now, add the conditions. A sudden collision. An airbag deployment strong enough to fill a cabin with dust and chemical residue. A smell often described by crash survivors as sharp, metallic, almost explosive. Cold air cutting through a thin jacket. Snow on the ground. Ice on the pavement. Disorientation in the first moments after impact. In ideal conditions, a trained athlete can cover significant distance in 7 minutes. But this is not an ideal environment. This is a dark rural road in winter. After a collision, speed becomes limited. Movement becomes unstable. Every step carries friction. Even under optimistic assumptions, a fast jog would place Maura only a few thousand feet from the crash site. Far enough to leave the immediate scene, not far enough to escape the geometry of the road itself.
Route 112 does something important at night. It concentrates visibility. Headlights stretch across the snow like a moving spotlight. Anything on the road becomes visible at a distance. A silhouette against white ground. A figure with nowhere to blend in. Officer Cecil Smith later testified that he did not pass anyone on his approach to the scene. No walkers, no hitchhikers, no one moving along the road. Just an empty stretch leading directly into the crash site. That creates a problem. If Maura stayed on the road, she should have been visible. If she moved west, she would have been moving toward incoming responders. If she moved east, she would have been heading deeper into isolation. Every direction leads to detection, or delay, or exposure. The timeline does not expand here. It compresses.
Every possible route becomes constrained by distance, by light, by time. And then there is the snow. If she entered the woods, there should be a trace. If she stayed on the road, there should be a sighting. One system records movement. The other records visibility. Yet neither gives a complete answer. The escape radius does not identify where Maura went. It identifies something more restrictive, where she could not reasonably have gone without being seen. It reduces the entire landscape to a narrow band of possibility. A strip of road watched from multiple directions. A tree line that should have recorded entry. And a center point where neither explanation fully holds. By the end of the 7 minutes, the physics of the scene leave only one certainty. Every direction carries a contradiction. And the space between those contradictions is where the disappearance takes place.
In the middle of a missing person case, investigators found something that didn't behave like evidence is supposed to behave. It didn't point forward. It didn't point backward. It pointed inward. A white cotton rag stuffed into the tailpipe of Maura Murray's Saturn. At first glance, it looks almost meaningless. A small object in a large scene. A detail you would normally pass over. But in this case, it refuses to stay small.
Maura's father, Fred Murray, later offered an explanation. He said he had told Maura that her car was experiencing mechanical issues, that it sometimes smoked, and that if she ever had to drive it, she should use a rag in the exhaust to reduce visible smoke and avoid attention from police. On its own, that explanation is logical, even practical. A simple instruction between parent and child about a failing vehicle. But logic changes shape when it is placed inside a specific moment.
February 9th, 2004. A crashed car on Route 112. Airbags deployed. Front end damaged. Witnesses nearby. A timeline already collapsing under its own constraints. To place that rag into the tailpipe, Maura would have needed to move to the rear of the vehicle, lower herself into the snow, use both hands, and spend several seconds completing a deliberate action while exposed in an open roadside environment. Those seconds matter. In a situation where every moment is compressed,
every action carries cost. Time spent standing still is time spent visible. Time spent visible is time spent within reach of witnesses. Then comes the contradiction. If the car was still functional, the rag makes sense as preparation. If the car was destroyed in the crash, the rag no longer serves a purpose. The same detail works in one version of the story and collapses in the other. That's where the tension begins. The scene suggests urgency, but the rag suggests deliberation. One moment of action that doesn't align with the pace of everything around it. And that raises a difficult question. Not about where Maura went, but about what she was doing. In the final moments, she was still visible. Because whatever the explanation, this wasn't a random object. It was handled, placed, intentional. And it sits there, at the edge of the timeline, like a fragment of thought left behind in a moment that was already breaking apart. The rag doesn't explain the disappearance. It complicates the person at the center of it. And once you account for it, the final minutes at the Saturn become harder to read than the crash itself. Because if Maura was still thinking clearly enough to do that, then the real question is not what she left behind. It's what she did immediately after. For more than 20 years, people have looked at the disappearance of Maura Murray and asked one question. Where did she go? But once you study the evidence closely, that question starts to feel incomplete. Maybe even misleading. To move closer to the truth, the focus has to shift. Away from theories, away from speculation, and back to the only things that can be verified. The timeline, physics, the contradictions. So let's strip everything back. No rumors, no second-hand interpretations. Only what the clock allows. Only what the environment permits. Only what the evidence consistently supports. A crash on Route 112. A frozen roadside scene. Witnesses positioned within sight of the vehicle. A brief interaction with a bus driver who stops to help. A call to authorities. And then, a short, collapsing window of time before police arrive. Inside that window, something critical happens. A witness turns away. A phone call is made. A patrol car is dispatched. And the crash site is left unattended for a matter of minutes. In that gap, no one reports seeing Maura Murray leave. No one confirms a direction of travel. No one identifies a clear movement away from the Saturn. What remains is a scene that feels complete on the surface, but incomplete at its center. A car, belongings, fresh snow, and no confirmed path taken by the person who was last seen there. The witness accounts never fully align. The snow does not preserve a clear exit. The timeline compresses under its own sequence of events. Each explanation introduces another tension, instead of resolving the previous one. The accepted version of events suggests a simple conclusion. That Maura Murray walked away from the crash site and disappeared into the surroundings. Yet each layer of evidence places strain on that idea. Not in isolation, but when combined.
After rebuilding the timeline piece by piece, the focus shifts. The mystery is no longer just about location. It becomes about structure, about whether the sequence itself holds together under scrutiny. Because if the timeline is correct, the disappearance should make sense. But if the timeline contains fractures, then every explanation built on it inherits those same fractures. The question is no longer where Maura Murray went. The question is whether the version of events we've accepted for years can fully account for what the evidence shows. And once that question is asked, the disappearance stops being a search for a missing person and becomes an investigation into the timeline itself.
Every mystery has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But on Route 112, the end seems to arrive before the beginning ever fully makes sense. We return to the same stretch of road, the same bend, the same frozen silence. White snow stretching across the landscape, like a blank record of what should have happened and what didn't.
When I started this investigation for the Unclosed, I was searching for a missing person. I expected a trail, a footprint, a direction that could be followed backward through time. Instead, what I found was something else entirely. A pattern of events that looks stable at first glance, but becomes harder to hold together the longer you examine it. A crash, witnesses nearby, a brief exchange at the roadside, a call for help, and a short window of time before police arrive to find an empty scene.
We were told there was time. Time to run, time to hide, time to disappear into the surrounding landscape. But when the timeline is reconstructed step by step, that time begins to collapse under its own structure. Every action consumes seconds. Every witness interaction narrows the window. Every physical constraint reduces what is possible inside that space. And what remains is not a wide field of possibilities, but a narrow corridor of contradiction. Before we can answer where Maura Murray went, we may first need to understand how she was able to disappear in the first place. If this investigation changed the way you see the timeline, consider subscribing. The search continues, and in the Unclosed, the case remains exactly that, unclosed. If this investigation taught us anything, it's that a single detail can change an entire case. The same thing happened with D.B. Cooper. For decades, one question seemed impossible to answer. When did he jump? I believe the evidence finally gives us an answer. Click the video on your screen and see if you reach the same conclusion.